Welcome to Flipping the Table. Today, Michael talks with Stuart Woolf, one of California's most successful and large-scale farmers. Stuart is committed to healthy soil, a diverse crop mix, and constant innovation. His company's approach is meant to ensure the family's operation can adapt to the complex and constantly changing realities of farming in the modern world. He also has a vision for a new commercial crop and a new beverage category, California agave spirits. Enjoy the show.
Hello, I'm a guy known for promoting the small and mid-scale farmers and ranchers as part of a regional food system. But I'm also known for not equating big agriculture with bad agriculture. Some of the very best farming I've seen is done by very big operations. It all comes down to the approach of farmers and ranchers to their land, their workers, their community, and the society at large. What I really care about is a care for the soil, and most importantly, a focus on diversity. Because diversity is key to resilience. Diversity of scale, diversity of crops and breeds, cultures and cuisines, and ways of thinking all make agriculture more adaptive, interesting, healthy, and beautiful. That is why I hold my guest today, Stuart Woolf, in high esteem. He is among the best examples of a large-scale farmer that I know. His family has farmed for 3 generations, and for most of that time centered on the west side of the great Central Valley of California along Highway 5, near the small rural town of Huron, which is about 55 miles southwest of Fresno. If you've ever driven down Highway 5 from the Bay Area to Los Angeles, you've driven right through land he farms. The Woolf Farming Company grows almonds, pistachios, canning tomatoes, grains, garlic, rosemary, cover crops, and as of late, agave, which some of you will know is the plant distilled to make tequila and mezcal. Until last year, Stuart was CEO and president of his family's company, which has about 100 full-time employees and farms about 30,000 acres across the state. With his nephew now running day-to-day operations, Stuart has time to focus on a passion for growing a plant that is tough and consumes only about 10%, I'll say that again, 10% of the water of nuts or tomatoes. And when harvested, cooked, pressed to capture the juices, and then distilled, it becomes a very popular spirit. In fact, tequila and mezcal are the fastest growing products in the spirits category. So today we'll explore Stuart's approach to agriculture and how he came to see agave as a great crop to experiment with and what he thinks it might create for California's farmers and his community. I know you will appreciate Stuart's focus on resilience and enjoy his optimism and faith in California agriculture's long-term future. Let's begin. Stuart Woolf, it is great to be here at your farming operation just outside Huron, California, in the heart of the Central Valley, really. How are you today?
I'm doing great. And Michael, it's great having you back to Woolf Farming.
It's been a while.
It's like a couple decades, I think.
It might be 7 years, 6 or 7 years. I remember I came and gave me a tour of almonds. It was during the drought, actually, because I remember the trees. They were having to drink water from the ground, and they were browning. I remember you worried about that. I remember you taking me out to your beautiful fields of tomatoes, and we sat on the harvester while they were working it, and that was a lot of fun. And I'm a big tomato paste fan. So.
Wait, that was only 7 years ago?
Yeah. Time flies when you're having fun. So anyway, we're here today because you sit in a very interesting position as chairman of the board now of Woolf Farming Company. Mm-hmm. And it's a very interesting operation. So I want you to talk about your origin story. Like, how did you get to this? And then tell us about the actual farming operation.
Yeah. So years ago, I'm going to be turning 66 in May, but when I was about 3 years old, I was living in Huron and with my family.
3 years old?
3 years old, my family, we moved to Fresno. And anyway, there were 6 kids in my family. And then, fast forward, my father was working for a guy named Russell Giffen, who was a pioneer kind of out in this area. And after about a 35-year career with Russell, he started his own farming operation, Woolf Farming. He started that in 1974 when he was 57.
Wow.
And at the time, I was about 15 or 16 years old. And so I found myself coming out and weeding and driving tractors, driving the water trucks. Kind of, my dad was really big about, his sons going out and working and doing the things that other people did on the ranch. And so, there's a number of people that still work here that I spent time working in the fields with. And
Wow.
But that experience, what it really taught me was I am not cut out for farming. I do not want to do this. And I ended up going to Berkeley. I then went and got an MBA at Boston College. And like for the first time, my father came out when I was graduating from college, and I was married at the time. And he just said, I think you're missing an opportunity here with the family farming operation. And you're making a judgment call kind of based on your past experience. But for the first time, he really spoke to kind of his real love for farming and the reason that he was out on the farm all the time and wasn't at home as much as, I would have liked him to have been is because he just was so passionate about it. He loved being out there. He would tell me he never felt like he had really a day of work in his life. It was just kind of a joy to go out there. And he encouraged me to come out and give it a go. So I did. And in those early years...
What year would that have been that you came back?
I came back in 1986.
Okay.
And when I started, he set aside a couple fields for me to kind of manage on my own. And it didn't take that long before I realized this is just the coolest thing, being a farmer and starting with like a sack of seed and growing tons of something. And it was just really cool.
What were you growing back in those days?
Well, then we were growing processing tomatoes. This is before we built our processing facility. We had a scattering of pistachios and almonds. To my dad's credit, when he started his own farming operation, he didn't want to be dependent on the traditional commodity crops here. So those would have been, like grains, melons, cotton. There was some processing tomatoes. But he really wanted to focus on crops where California had strategic advantage and crops that you got a better return per acre foot of water. He was in a part of Westlands that received less water than the vast majority of the district. And it's kind of interesting, even when back in the 70s, he started using drip irrigation and futzing around with it. And the reason that's kind of astounding, because he was getting most of the water he needed, but he still saw it as a limited resource. And we were still, we could suffer from droughts and all this kind of stuff. So he was kind of an early pioneer in that, but he believed in changing his crop mix to crops that were far different than what were being grown here.
So an early interest in diversity. Why don't you describe the operation today, like all the different things that you guys do?
Yeah, so today, we really have a couple primary crops, and those would be processing tomatoes, pistachios, almonds, and then we rotate crops like garlic, sometimes some onions, not too often, but grains. And of late, because we don't have enough water to farm all of our property, we're cover cropping several thousand acres that we just include into our overall rotation to improve soil health and that. But those three are the primary crops that my father, Jack Woolf, kind of chose back in the 70s, and they've all done well.
Wow. And I think you said that he lived to 103?
Well, just shy of 103. He almost made it to 103, and he was out at the ranch kind of up till the last couple months of his life, because this is what he just loved doing. Even when he turned in his license at 100, and he had a driver, but he would come out to the ranch, and you're actually looking at his office right here. So.
Oh, wow, yeah. I'm in his office looking up over your shoulders at the pistachio field out there, and you were just telling me there were a bunch of sheep in there until recently.
Yeah, so a lot of our pistachios on the ranch were we're letting the centers go and the weeds go. And I should say we planted some cover crops out there, but then we sheep them off instead of using herbicides and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I was just at Craig McNamara's.
Sure, great guy.
Yeah, great guy. I was at his walnut ranch last Thursday, and there were sheep. They had sheep out there on the fields because his son is now raising a lot of sheep. So for the same reason, really nice to see. So, is it fair to say, I mean, this is my impression of you because I have known you for a few years, and you seem like you guys have always been very focused on trying to do it well. And you don't fit the stereotype of many people that are in the world of wanting to change food systems as the big grower that's doing bad things. You've never been that in my mind.
Well, I don't know how you're defining that exactly. It's funny, right now I'm perceived to be a big agave grower because I have a couple hundred acres of agave.
Which we're going to get to.
Yeah, and I think some of the people in that industry look at me as like the big guy to be anxious about or whatever. But no, my dad had this whole thing about, you farm every acre as if it's your only acre. And so, we just love farming. And so through the years when we had, say, a neighbor or somebody wanting to get out, we were always interested in staying in. So our families kind of plowed our earnings, by and large, all back into this farming operation. And my siblings and I, what's remarkable, this is a family business. There's 6 in my generation, and they're all very proud of ownership. Mm-hmm. And they're not all out here farming, but they really hold this property and my parents' legacies. We hold that kind of dear to us.
Would you mind saying how many acres you farm now?
Well, we farm in total about 30,000 acres, plus or minus. The home ranch, and really the stuff in Westlands, represents about 20,000 acres. Mm-hmm. And we started moving some of our more water-intensive crops out of this area where we really struggle here. And we started planting, for example, almonds in other regions of the state where there was better water resources and groundwater. And this was kind of part of our program to figure out how do we hang on to this land. Well, part of it was we need to invest elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Smart diversity. I mean, when I think of you, and this goes back, I think of someone who, and you described it, this idea of diversification, diversity of crops, adaptation, new technologies, new stuff, vertical integration. You can talk about the tomatoes. It'd be interesting. I think people would like to hear that because California is such a huge tomato paste producer. Yeah, why don't you just talk a little bit about the tomato paste operation?
Sure. So this region, Fresno County, is the most productive tomato growing region in the world. And we have a very long season. And there are a lot of larger farms in this area. And I'll touch on why that's so important. If you're going to buy a commercial tomato harvester, that's going to run you about $550,000 to $600,000. And all it does is harvest tomatoes for about 100 days every year. So you have to have the acreage and the tonnage to go through one of those machines in order for it to be cost effective and efficient and what have you. And so because we had larger farms out here and we have kind of the perfect soils, we're in the right latitudes. Thing about the Central Valley, it's from a farming perspective, you have all these alluvial soils that came out of the coastal range and the Sierras, and it's just this great patchwork of soil here. And, we have an entrapped air basin, and so we do end up with a lot of pollution and what have you that just stays in the valley. But the other thing, it stays in the valley because of this air basin. But if you think of it like a giant greenhouse, this is like I believe it's the most productive region in the world for the diversity of crops it has and the yields we can get and the long, hot summers and the irrigation. It's just incredible. And when I have friends from the Midwest or from other countries that come here and visit, it just kind of blows their mind,
It is. I was driving in today, came over from the East Bay area, and just driving through the fields. It's a beautiful time of year because it's so green. And I was just reminded, as I am every time I drive through this region, how spectacular it is in terms of agricultural diversity and scope and scale. It is remarkable. We are blessed.
Oh, we're completely blessed. And, we can grow over, I don't know, something like 300 or 400 different crops here commercially. And if you think of California in total is about 100 million acres in size. For irrigated agriculture here in the state, it really represents about 8.5 million acres, 8.5% of the state's acreage. But we produce a bounty that, feeds much of the nation. Mm-hmm. And the nation has a couple 100 million acres of farm ground. Not all of it is irrigated. Not all of it is as diverse. It's just so incredible that if you're going to grow something, California is a great place to be.
It's true.
Oh, there was a question about
the tomatoes. Yeah. So
Okay.
What year did you guys decide to build your own plant? Because it's a competitive market. That's my background, was working with tomatoes for Riverbend. You might remember that company from years ago, and they had the plant down in Visalia.
Sure.
And so, when did you decide to vertically integrate, and why, and how has that worked?
Well, we realized tomatoes is a crop that we did enjoy competitive advantage in Fresno County. We could out-yield other tomato growers kind of throughout the world. And anyway, so we were very, very aware of that. The other thing in Fresno, within California, we start a little earlier down here, and we can actually grow this crop late into the season. So, this is a crop that this county historically would grow about, a third to 40% of the state's crop right here. And so years went by, and what would happen, we would grow for companies like Heinz and other processors. And as the season would move north, it could happen that they would abandon fields here, so they wouldn't have to make the long haul. And it was about 1988, and the canneries had pulled out of this area, and we lost about 15,000 tons that we just had to disc up because none of the canneries would take them.
Was that the year that the paste price crashed because of the Gulf War? The first
can't
Gulf War?
remember.
I think it was.
Because
I was in that. I was a sales guy then when that was happening.
Yeah. So anyway, I just remember my dad, who never popped a vein or lost his temper or whatever. I remember when he was being told that they couldn't take the tons, he just said, well, that's okay. It disappoints me greatly, but, we're going to figure out how to move on and everything. And after the guy representing the cannery left, I said, Dad, I just can't figure out, you don't seem wound up. And this is a big hit to us, it was like $750,000. And that was a lot of money for us. And he said, no, those guys just helped me with a decision to build a tomato facility, and we're going to start on that tomorrow.
Good for him.
Yeah. And the simple thought was, if we could build a tomato facility in the middle of the most productive tomato growing region in the world with the shortest haul, we should be able to kind of stick it out. So in about 1990, we had a plant that would run 350,000 tons. We were so sure of ourselves that we thought we better go down to the desert and haul tomatoes in to run those tomatoes before our crop
from the Imperial Valley
to get all the bugs out of the system, right?
Right.
And anyway, that's a long haul and it's expensive. But the plant started, it ran well, and then from there we produced some really good thick paste that, as you well know, this is what the industry really wanted, was high viscosity, thick, low Bostwick paste. And we were able to do that very, very well. And from there, we then just started growing the business. And so today, we have capacity for about 1.1 million tons.
Wow.
But, it was a real simple thought process. Let's just build the plant in the middle of the most productive region with the lowest hauling cost. And the haul is a huge cost item on that lower value tomatoes.
Right. Wow. Interesting. But also it shows, again, forward thinking, seeing kind of what was possible, and also demand was growing worldwide at that point. So that's, except for that 1 year, the Gulf War. So that's interesting. So I want to get into this whole idea of diversification. And one of the things that I've noticed is through the years, there's a lot of terminology around this idea of sustainable agriculture. So that was organic was first, it's kind of in its own category, but then there was this idea of sustainable agriculture that's not quite organic, but aiming towards the same thing, to keep agriculture alive in perpetuity. Then we moved to this idea of climate smart, was kind of the terminology that the state uses even still for a lot of its grant programs. And now we're talking about regenerative agriculture, and the state is now defined, or is in the final stages of defining that term legally so that it can grant money for programs around that, healthy soils and things like that. So I'm just curious, because sometimes I hear a lot of skepticism from growers around the fact that this word changes all the time, like it's a trend or it's a fad. What are your thoughts on that? I'm curious.
Well, I think the different terms or whatever, you could maybe argue they're fads or the terminology. But for me, the simple concept and idea is like, we moved through a part of agriculture where we got turned on to synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and all this kind of stuff. And there's no doubt that like in my dad's era, they really drove yields and really had a positive impact on yields. And what they probably didn't appreciate was maybe the impact on the soils and what have you. So, I think there's no doubt, I'm very interested, like right now, like if I can leave our family's operation to the next generation, like in bigger and better shape than it was received, that's kind of our family mission statement. But I think if I can improve the soils, even if it's the same land base and it's not larger than or whatever than it was received, I think what a cool thing. Mm-hmm. If my kids ended up with ground that was even more productive, had greater ability to retain moisture, So for me, that's not a fad at all. I think that's like a really cool thing to be looking at soil health. So when I think of regenerative ag, I really link it to soil health. Regenerative ag by itself, though, it's not easy. Right. It's a process that you need to like own and carry through. But we do have a diversity of crops. Like one of the issues that I'm anxious about, all the cover crops and stuff we have on the ranch, those can become a host environment for insects that we're kind of battling in tomatoes or almonds or what have you. And so it's really about finding the right balance and really knowing your populations and what's going on. So it's hard work.
It's science.
It's science. It takes a lot of effort, but our goal, and we believe we're seeing it, and the way that we're seeing positive benefits from these practices. So one thing that I noticed a couple of years ago when we had a real wet winter, normally our roadways here would be flooded. There would be floodwaters on the ends of every field. Water would be moving all across the property. When we planted all those cover crops, it just took that moisture in. We didn't have the amount of flooding.
Beautiful.
It was incredible. And you knew that it was percolating, going in the ground. So,
that was the evidence. That was the proof.
Well, it's funny. There's not like one single measurement of true soil health. And so you can go out and try to measure carbon in the soil, and you can do all these different things. But at the end of the day, we know the tilth of the soil is better. It doesn't work up as cloddy as it used to. We know that it takes in, the moisture. And my guys out in the field are reporting a whole host of other items that they think are of value.
Corollary benefits.
Yeah. And so, I think for the USDA to really create programs where they're helping fund and direct dollars, I think they got to really figure out how do we measure this to really encourage and have an impact. And I don't know that we're there yet, but I think we're headed that way.
Mm-hmm. We have been.
Yeah. But I want to go back to sustainable farming or, the farming that we were doing just as conventional growers was very sustainable. I don't know of anybody that farmed their way out of existence kind of thing. And our yields had continued to improve. And an operation like this, we're adopting all kinds of practices. It's not like we're just in one lane. We're always trying to figure out if we can farm smarter and better. And so it doesn't mean, well, we just need more synthetic materials. We adopt and adapt, and I think that's part of farming. And so anyway,
that is kind of the heart of farming. I mean,
Yeah.
it's constant adaptation because nature is constantly evolving, and trying to track nature is really complex. One thing I noticed is when I first got here, I was reading the recent almond board publication, almond industry, kind of the state of the almond industry.
the almond almanac.
The almond almanac, yeah. And there was an interesting little piece in there about the fact that a lot of the synthetics are becoming less effective. Like the pests are ahead of the synthetics.
Yeah.
So this gets back to that thing you said about balance. Like, how do you find that balance where you have a dynamic where there's enough beneficials to handle and you don't get a lot of crop loss? That is complex.
It's super complex, and every year the balance changes depending on weathers and when you're getting warm weather and what insects are hatching and what, it's this. This is what I love about farming. It's like every year you start a whole new season with a whole new set of challenges. I often tell people, friends of mine in the Bay Area, it's like football season starts again, and you've got new players, you've got all this stuff, and you don't know how it's going to end, but you're just in the thick of it. And anyway, and then you end up harvesting the crops, you figure out how you did, and you start all over again.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yes, I agree. So, as with this backdrop of the idea of water as a challenge, your family's real focus on water and the need to be smart about how you use water, you have now engaged in a whole new realm of agriculture having to do with the agave plant.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious about what sparked that, what your vision is, where you are in achieving that vision, where you want to go with it.
Yeah, no. So, let me just start by saying, you think about my dad when he started in 74, and he had plenty of water, surface water and well water. His primary focus was like, how do I optimize these lands that I'm irrigating? What crops do I grow? What percentages, how do I rotate all this stuff and all of that? So my challenge and the challenge of this generation, now that we don't have the water and we have a pretty good chunk of our ground, we estimate when SGMA is fully implemented,
Which is the state
Groundwater Management Act,
right?
That's going to reduce our ability to pump, and that together with just losing our basic water supply for a whole host of reasons, including climate change and what have you. So we know that in all likelihood we're going to be fallowing 30-40% of our ranch, our family's legacy. So our challenge is to figure out, how do we optimize those lands that we're not going to be irrigating? And, how do we generate income and what have you to allow the rest of it to continue to stay in place? So part of that, we're entering into long-term solar leases. We've taken property out in this area where you can recharge and bank water in those wet periods. And so we have a number of water basins. I think I said earlier, we moved some of our water-intensive crops off of this ranch. What else? Well, I know I'm leaving something else out, but eventually I got to a point where I was thinking, I just need a good, water or drought-resilient crop that I could grow that, we can utilize on some of this ground. It just so happens I really like tequila and mezcal.
Mm-hmm.
And one night at home while I was tasting and giving serious thought to what I like best, the thought occurred to me like, why aren't I trying to grow this crop? Here in California, where we have a lot of dry weather, we have a lot of attributes that they have in Jalisco, Mexico, and what have you. And I thought, I'm gonna take like a couple acres, set them aside, and have a test plot with like 12 different varieties, which I did.
Wow. What year was this?
That was probably 5 years ago.
Okay.
So 2020, June of 2020.
Mm-hmm. During the pandemic. Yeah, during the pandemic.
Yeah. So this was just kind of a fun project. I planted those things. Pretty much all of them did well. The other thing, I did a real in-depth study, which means I got in my car And I just drove around the west side. I drove around my neighborhood looking for agave plants. And surprisingly, they're kind of everywhere, and unless you're looking for them, they're just part of the landscape and you never notice them.
I have them on my street.
Well, I'm sure you do.
Because that was built in 1907, my street. So a lot of families were growing it then.
Yeah. And we have a lot of largely Latino rural communities in the area. And a lot of times these community members bring plants with them. And don't tell Karen Ross. Anyway, they get here somehow or another. But you drive around these towns and they're agave all over the place. And I would find them in areas where they weren't being irrigated and they were thriving. So it really caused me to take the next step. So now at the end of probably here in the next couple of weeks, we will have about 450 acres planted.
Wow.
And that equates to about 500,000 plants.
Wow.
Now, those would have been planted over a 3-year span. So call it 150 acres a year to make things simple. And I'm growing a handful of different varieties, but I'm super excited about this. I think it's a lot of fun.
We hope you're enjoying this conversation of Flipping the Table. Please subscribe to this podcast and write us a brief review and give us a rating. These help us to improve the show and to build our audience. More listeners will help grow the movement to make food and farming solutions to many environmental, health, and social problems we face. It's easy. Please subscribe, review, and rate. Now back to the conversation.
As many people will know, you can't harvest it, distill it, and call it tequila because it's not from the tequila region, the part of Mexico where it's grown. So what is the vision for the distilled liquor that comes from this? It's not spirits, it's not liquor, it's spirits.
Right, the spirits. Well, so one thing, we created an agave council. So we have an industry organization. Craig Reynolds. And we passed legislation to create a standard of identity for California that differs from Mexico. So in Mexico, all you need to do is have 51% agave sugars to call something a tequila.
Really? I didn't realize. Only 51%.
Only 51%. And it can only come from one variety of agave, known as Tecliana or Weber Azul or blue agave. So that's the one agave, and then there are particular regions in Mexico that you can only get that agave in those regions and call it tequila. Here in California, it has to be 100% from agave sugars. You're not going to put corn syrup and distill it and all that kind of stuff.
So that happens? I mean,
that's already in place.
But I mean, when you buy a Mexican tequila, you're getting corn sugar sometimes?
Well, you can, but really the higher end tequilas that I think most people are drinking generally say 100% on the bottle.
Okay.
But there's still things called mixto that is a mix of those. That's far cheaper. And if it's 100%, it will say so on that label.
Okay. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to get clear on that.
In California, it's got to be 100%, but you can use any varieties you want. And so we're not trying to make tequila, or we're not trying to make mezcal. We're trying to make a California spirit that has all of California's terroir, which is vastly different than what you have in Mexico. So in Mexico, around Jalisco, most of the growing areas are about 5,000 to 6,000 feet above sea levels. They're in different latitudes. They're in volcanic, iron-rich soils. Here on this farm, we're located at about 250 feet above sea level. We're entirely different latitudes, which means we have cold, wet winters and long, hot summers. In Mexico, they have warm, wet summers and then long, dry winters. And their cold temperatures don't go as low as ours, and their highs aren't as high either.
Because of the altitude.
Yeah. So, and the length of their summer is just flat shorter. So my hope is that if we farm these here and if we put them under drip and we get the right varieties, we should be able to grow a plant faster here in California, we should be able to grow the plant bigger and hopefully have more sugar. So that would offset some of the advantages Mexico has with very cheap labor and, those kind of things.
You'll have larger yields.
But we got to get there.
So you're in the experimental stage.
Yeah, we're still figuring that out. And we have found people that have plants that have matured. We've had some really terrific yields and plant size and sugars. And so it'll be interesting to see. But the whole point of this, we're not trying to make tequila or mezcal. We're trying to make, an agave spirit that will be unique to California.
I think that's exciting.
Yeah.
And so obviously the sugars are important because you have to distill it, and that's how you get to the alcohol. So why don't you talk about the state of the distilling industry and that piece of the puzzle?
Well, that's a great question. We just had an agave symposium, and one of the messages there, we're doing a great job planting this crop, and people are successfully growing it and planting more and more. So our acreage is increasing, but we really don't have enough processing or distilling capacity in the state to handle this crop, all of it. And the trend line would suggest we've got to see additional investments in distilling capacity. We're also hoping that maybe this crop can be used to make biofuel. It makes ethanol. So, we're also hoping that the leaves and the fibers in there can be used in some way for textiles or other things. But the first entry to kind of a channel for sales seems to me that our easiest path right now would be for distilling. And California isn't alone in trying to grow agave outside of Mexico. This is happening in Texas. I just shipped a container to Hawaii. It's happening in Israel. I have friends now in Australia, and we're all trying to create kind of our own spirit with our own terroir. So it's going to be really interesting. 10, 20 years from now, you'll likely be able to try these spirits from different regions of the world or different regions in the U.S. So it was just kind of a fun project.
That's cool. So how many acres total of agave are in California now, do you think, that would be, let's say, harvestable this year?
Oh, that would be harvested. I would guess the stuff that could be harvested is maybe 30 acres, maybe 40.
Oh, that's all. Okay,
Yeah.
so it's quite small.
And we've now have planted, I would estimate, about 700 acres.
Okay.
A year from now, I would fully expect that to probably be closer to 1,100. And then these plants are clonal, so they start producing their own clones, so people will have more plants to replant if they so choose. But I think I'm a little bit anxious and cautious about, I want to see the capacity go in to process it before I just...
Yeah, go hog wild.
Yeah, but think about it, Michael. We have a lot of pioneers out here that are growing a crop that's new to California that really technically doesn't have a home, but it's a huge leap of faith.
Yeah.
It's super exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting. And so, but you have distilled some California crop, right?
Yes.
I mean, so talk about what you're experiencing with these early distilled products.
Well, right now in this state, we have there's kind of 4 key craft distillers that have really kind of futzed around with this stuff. And I think, what we're finding is that you can make a pretty good spirit here, and it's different, It doesn't remind you of tequila. We're also making ensembles where we're taking different varieties and we're blending them, which is creating kind of a really unique spirit. We have some guys that are they're making different batches from different growers, growing different types of agave. We have one guy who is really focused on one variety only, and it's a variety that is found throughout California. And so he looks at it as more like a California variety.
Like one that was brought a long time ago by
called
immigrants, yeah.
Called Americana. But if I might, this is Ventura Spirits in Ventura.
Ventura Spirits. Okay, that's one of the companies. So
One of
people
the
should look for it.
companies.
Okay.
Venus,
Venus.
over in Santa Cruz. Sean Venus, just doing a great job over there. Shelter Distilling, that has a facility right now in Mammoth. And they've opened another, but they're bringing some plants from the Central Valley to process and everything. It's super cool. And then the guy doing the Americana is Gian Nelson, and real interesting guy, making some, really unique spirits.
So do people have to go to these distilleries to get the product, or is it on the market somewhere?
Some of these you can buy online directly from the distillery.
Ventura, Venice, Nelson's Americana, and then Shelter Distillery with a 4 you
Venus,
mentioned.
yeah.
Venus.
And
What did I say? Venus? Venus.
You said Venice.
Okay, sorry. Venus. Okay.
So they're out there, and these guys, they're also pioneers, right? So
Right.
They're playing with all different ways to handle this product and how to cook it and process it and everything. So it's, for me, it's a real fun, and for many, it's a fun journey to be trying these spirits as we're growing the crop. And it's kind of like hope building on top of hope.
Yeah.
And
well, that's actually a very good segue into kind of where I want to go next, because first of all, why don't you just tell people the difference in the amount of water an agave plant takes versus an almond tree or a cotton plant or...
Yeah, okay. So almonds typically use kind of in the neighborhood of 50 inches of water. Now, I just got to say, because this is my one moment, you get more than an almond off of that. You get almond hull, you get shell, and you have a growing tree that's a carbon sink. So, conversely, if you look at like a tomato crop generally will use about 30 inches, okay? And then pistachios, about 40. Last year on our crop, we used about 2.5 inches.
On your crop
of agave.
Of agave, 2.5 inches versus 30, 40, or 50.
50, yeah, substantially less. And
exponential.
Yeah, the friends of mine in Israel and Australia, they've told me, actually once we kind of got them rooted in, we just quit irrigating altogether. So we're going to play with some rows and see what happens if we just cut the water off entirely. The key to this crop is to build a little root system, but the trees, the agave, they actually make use of something called CAM, photosynthesis, which means most all of these crops out here we're looking at, they do all of their business during the day, photosynthesizing. Agave and desert plants do that at night. And then they open the stomata, the cell structure of the leaves, and they capture dews in their leaves, like, in the early mornings, and then they go dormant all day long. So the leaf structure itself is like a sponge pulling in water. So they don't have extensive root systems because they're using other parts of the plant.
Using the atmosphere to
which is, again, it's a crazy cool plant, right?
Yeah. And well adapted because, the world, the data says that it's getting drier and hotter, a more extreme weather situation. Labor's expensive in California. Energy's expensive. Now we have trade issues potentially. So I want to get into this. So, you have many years of leadership in the agricultural world here in the state of California on lots of boards. And so I'm very curious about your long-term view of the state's agriculture industry. And, I know, like you said, to be a farmer, you kind of have to be an optimistic person. You got to have faith that it's going to work out. But also you got to be realistic because it's on the ground realism every day. So when you think about the next, how you've been 30 years, 40 years farming?
Something like that.
Okay. So when you think that far out, 30, 40 years, what do you see?
Oh, I see a successful agriculture.
Okay. Tell me why.
But it's going to be vastly different. It may be a little bit smaller. Maybe we're only at 8 million acres, not 8.5. Could we see 500,000 acres come out of production? Yep. I think that's what PPIC says,
right.
That we're going to see 500 to 1 million acres. But what I'm curious about, will California farmers continue to adapt and figure out how do they make the best use of the resources that are available to them? So if we're losing resources like water, or labor. We're already seeing investments in how to further mechanize a lettuce harvest or strawberries or pick something that requires a lot of labor. I think we'll continue to see research and investment there. A lot of this ground that we're having to fallow right now, I think we're going to see much more renewable energy, solar and what have you on a lot of these fields. We're going to see growers adapting to like what we're doing, drought-tolerant crops. So some of this land can stay in production. We're going to see a lot of different changes. So, I personally believe we've seen like peak almond. We have about 1.5 million acres out of the 8.5. Might that drop back to something less? I would think so. Might we see the same thing long-term with pistachios? I would think so. We'll probably see fewer dairies. We'll see that shrink down more. Keep in mind on the 8.5 million acres, we continue to grow alfalfa and a lot of forage crops that are lower value crops. There's still a big chunk of that in the state. So the cropping pattern is going to change. The thing that absolutely kind of drives me crazy, I think we're going to see fewer of the legacy family farmers that have been here forever. And I think we're going to continue to see investment from funds and what have you that come in and buy up this land. Again, this land, it really is kind of a national treasure. It's, as I mentioned at the start of this thing, it's the largest body of the most diverse and strong farm ground and the right latitudes with the mountain ranges and everything. It's just perfect. And I think it's going to end up in fewer hands. And a lot of people think, well, it's just the large guys squeezing out the small guys. There's a lot more to it than that. Quite frankly, we like having the small guys at our processing plants. We also are in the almond processing business, and we represent a lot of smaller growers there. And we rely on other growers to grow tomatoes that bring crop here. I would much rather be relying on a family farmer than I would with an investor out of Chicago or something. Nothing against the investor there, but that family farmer will typically be in the valley. He'll be living here. He'll be giving back to the valley. I think that's the thing that I really am kind of puckers over. Yeah. Because I know friends and neighbors that are thinking, I don't want my kids to do this and have to deal with all of this and everything. It's capital intensive. It's risky farming. If you're not integrated or if you're not at scale, it's a harder game. And believe it or not, in this state, we have a lot of regulatory kind of issues and reporting. It's just an expensive place to farm. So you got to be really good. You got to be thinking, you got to have a long-term vision and view and a strategic plan and be thinking about how to change it. And if you're relying on others to figure out, how you're going to survive, that's going to be a tough road. I think you got to adapt.
California has an unfair advantage. It has the natural resource base, as you've described it so well, but it does have a disadvantage when it competes against many other places in the world because of environmental law, because of the labor restrictions, the cost of labor, which in my view, it's good that farm workers are paid more because they have lived in poverty. And it's nice they're getting paid more. I know it's harder on the growers. I know a lot of my organic farming friends who were really resistant to the increase in pay for farm workers because of the impact on their businesses. But that's a challenge that we have. That's one of the realities of our world, that we have this demand for low-cost food, which one of the few places farmers have control is over their labor costs. So it's a tough battle, I understand. But I'm heartened to hear that you think there is a bright future. I do believe that agriculture is incredibly adaptive, and as long as we keep having good investment in science and the science, because as you explained, and I see in many different areas, to be a really good farmer, you have to be kind of like a Renaissance person. You have to understand science and business and human relations. It is not easy. A lot of businesses don't have as many variables, it seems to me, because you've got climate on top of it all. So it's a pretty amazing thing, and California has done well. We have less farmers than we used to. We have less farmland. So there are considerable challenges, but I'm glad to hear you say that you think there's a bright future, but it won't be easy, because it's never been easy.
It's never been easy.
Yeah, it's a tough world. So, but I'm really excited that you're going to get into this agave world. I think that's going to be quite interesting, and it will be interesting to see in 20 years. Is this like the beginning of what Napa Valley was in the 1950s and 60s? I mean, it's quite interesting, and it could turn into something. And people aren't drinking wine like they used to; they're moving to spirits, and so maybe you're going to ride that big wave.
Well, we'll find out, I guess. But no, I think the wine example is kind of what we're looking at. When California arrived on the scene with like really good wines, and what was it, 76, the Judgment of Paris or whatever, I think that just kind of shocked everybody. But today, if I'm buying a bottle of wine, I mean, I totally know like if I'm interested in a California wine, which I think is going to be very different than something from France or Spain or what have you. My hope is that, we're all going to explore some of these categories of spirits and develop, I think it's going to be really cool to sit back and try like a spirit from Israel versus Australia versus Hawaii versus California.
That was interesting about Hawaii. I didn't know about Hawaii. It'll be very tropical.
It's a great, believe it or not, it's like this great area for some of those varieties. And
wow,
it's super cool.
Well, I think we've had a good conversation. I think we're going to go take a little tour of some of the stuff now. So that'd be really nice. And Stuart, really appreciate your time and always appreciate your vision for agriculture, and best of luck in this new endeavor.
Michael, thank you for the time. Appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed the show. Please share it with your friends and listen to our next monthly episode of Flipping the Table, hosted by Roots of Change, a program of the Public Health Institute, a nonprofit organization dedicated to building a healthier world.